From New York City, I'm Stephen Shalowitz, and this is the One Way Ticket Show. I'm dipping into our archives and releasing here on YouTube a conversation I recorded in 2016 with law professor Alan Dershowitz. What struck me revisiting it is how relevant his insights still are, and in many ways, even more so today. Have a listen, and I'm sure you'll agree. Once again, we've left our studios and have traveled across town. This time we find ourselves in the home of the man who's been called one of the nation's most distinguished defenders of individual rights, also the best-known criminal lawyer in the world, and the top lawyer of last resort. Of course, I can only be talking about Professor Alan Dershowitz. Professor Dershowitz is the Felix Frankfurter Professor Emeritus of Law at Harvard Law School. He joined the faculty there at age 25 and at just 28 became the youngest full professor in the law school's history. Professor Dershowitz has published well over 1,000 articles, has written more than 30 books, has taught subjects ranging from philosophy to delicatessens, has advised many world leaders, and participated in some of the most famous precedent-setting legal cases of the past 50 years. He's a man in constant demand, which makes us especially appreciative that he's carved out time to invite us into his home to share his one-way ticket destination and more. Thank you, Alan, for this opportunity. Great to see you and welcome aboard the One-Way Ticket Show.
Well, thank you. It sounds like a terrific and interesting concept, the one-way ticket.
Thanks very much for that. And you are a busy man. You are a man in demand. We're going to talk about how you manage your time a little bit later on in the show. But before we get to that, I have to issue your one-way ticket. That's why we're here today. If I gave you a one-way ticket, which can be in the past, present, future, real or imaginary, can even be a state of mind. If I gave you a one-way ticket, where would you go?
Oh, that's very easy for me because I fantasized and dreamed and had nightmares about it, and that would be Germany 1932. I would want to have been in the belly of the beast when the Holocaust was beginning. I would have wanted to devote my life and all my energies to seeing if there was any way of preventing it or minimizing the loss of life. It would truly have been a one-way ticket because there's almost no way anybody could have survived that. But I often dream about that. In fact, I wrote a novel about it called Just Revenge, where I really tell the story of what happened to my family and how the quest for revenge years later ends in a dramatic trial. But for me, the idea that I was denied the opportunity to participate in the most cataclysmic event in Jewish history and one of the most cataclysmic events in world history has always been something that I yearn for, and I wish I could go back in time and play some role, if at all possible, in minimizing or preventing the horrors of the Holocaust.
It's a very personal one-way ticket then for you because you did have family members that perished in the Holocaust,
right.
And your own father, I believe, helped to save Jews.
My grandfather, mostly. My grandfather with the help of my father, but my grandfather, who was very poor, small guy in Williamsburg, had a little shul in Brooklyn, and he found that 29 members of our family were living in Brno, Czechoslovakia, and he managed to get false affidavits for all of them. He went around the neighborhood and declared every basement to be a shul, and every shul in need of a rabbi, a cantor, a moil, a shamus, and even 10-year-old kids got jobs, and 28 of the 29 were rescued on the eve of the Holocaust. The 30th was trapped in Poland, and my grandfather sent his oldest unmarried son, Milton, to marry her in Poland, and he did. It was a fake marriage. Brought her out, and on the boat back, he fell in love with her and actually married her, and they lived together for 50 years. So for me, yeah, and I recently went back to Poland, where my family came from, and went to the small town where much of my family had emigrated.
And what's the name of the town?
It's called Pilsno. It's to the south of Tarnów and Rzeszów and about 100 miles to the east of Krakow. And when I was there, we hired an expert on Jewish genealogy, and he told me some just terrible stories about my own family, how a 15-year-old girl who was very beautiful was taken as a sex slave by the Nazis and then murdered, and how her slightly older brother was the secretary to the commandant at Auschwitz and was hanged. And everybody in that part of my family died except one person who was in the underground and made it to the United States. Of course, I have a personal interest, but I also have an interest as a person who cares deeply about human rights, who cares deeply about the Jewish community. And it's frustrating to look back and wonder what could have been done. Let me give you a few examples just out of the blue. So there's an island called Rhodes, which is a Greek island, but probably halfway between Greece and Israel, not too far from very close to Turkey. And Jews had lived in Rhodes since the Babylonian exile, and they were not rich, they were not Jewish capitalists, they were tradesmen, they were leather workers, they were people who engaged in small trade. And they were safe under Mussolini when Mussolini was in control of Greece, but once Mussolini was killed and Hitler occupied Italy, took over Greece, they never warned. Nobody warned. The Jewish community in America, the Jewish community in Palestine, the Jewish community, what was left of it in parts of Europe, never warned the Jews of Rhodes of what was going to happen to them. They could have easily just taken rowboats and rowed to Turkey, a neutral country, and been saved. But nothing was done, and virtually every member of the Jewish community of Rhodes was taken by boat to the mainland, shipped by train to Auschwitz, and murdered. On a larger scale, what happened to the Jews of Hungary, who also were not harmed particularly until the very end of the war, and there weren't enough sufficient warnings to help them escape. Zell tells the story about how shocked he and every member of his family was when they came to pick them up. Nobody had warned them, nobody had cautioned them. And I just think that more could have been done, and that's why I put myself back at a place where, if it was at all possible, I know I would have done whatever I could have to help save as many Jews as possible. I did have the opportunity to do that on a much smaller scale with Soviet Jewry, and on a different scale. Of course, I've spent a lot of my life defending Israel from threats, both external and internal, but the greatest tragedy that ever befell the Jewish people was the Shoah, the Holocaust, and for me it would have been very important to my life to have been able to do something, even if it was futile, even if I couldn't do it successfully, just to try to do something to save the remnants of Europe. An entire civilization was destroyed. One of the greatest civilizations in the history of the world, which will never be replicated, that is Eastern European, Yiddish-speaking Judaism, secular Judaism, religious Judaism, every kind of Judaism. It was an entire civilization. Some of it moved to Israel, some of it moved to the United States, some of it moved to where I was born in Brooklyn. But we'll never see a situation of the kind that was in Poland, where 3 million Jews lived vibrant lives. The new museum in Warsaw tells their story. Or the Jews of Lithuania, which was the Jerusalem of Europe, where some of the greatest Talmudic and secular writings grew, and artistic. We'll never see that again. It was the death of a civilization. And could it have been prevented? Nobody knows. Could greater efforts have been made? Yes.
How implicit do you think was the U.S. government in not helping the Jews? I think about, for example, in 1939, the SS St. Louis, when Cordell Hull, Secretary of State, advised President Roosevelt not to take the ship after it was denied entry into Havana.
There's no question that the State Department was dominated by virulent anti-Semites, and the man put in charge, who has a statute to him in the State Department, was a horrible anti-Semite who wrote memos that have now come to light about how to keep the Jews out. And then, of course, you had senators like Senator Bilbo on the floor of the Senate using words that nobody would use today on the floor of the Senate to describe Jews. The same thing was true in England, although Churchill was a Philo-Semite and loved the Jews. He didn't do enough. The failure to bomb the rail lines at Auschwitz, the failure to make threats against the Nazi leaders, it all came too little too late.
And Roosevelt?
And Roosevelt, of course, was at fault. It was the world we lived in. Remember, too, that originally the Nazi goal was to rid Europe of the Jews, and had countries around the world been willing to take Jews, I've often wondered why the West didn't just capture Martinique and Guadeloupe from Nazi-occupied France, two little islands, and welcome 1 million Jews to be on those islands or other places.
There was a Madagascar plan, wasn't there?
Wasn't
it crazy?
Kinds of plans.
Yeah.
Nothing was crazy, but nothing was successful. 1 million Jews could have spent the war years in Iceland, which at the time had a population smaller than Borough Park, where I was born. There were so many possible routes to rescue, but nobody wanted Jews. And that's why it's so important for Israel to have a law of return that should never change, because Jews have always been the most persecuted minority, and you always have to have one safe place of asylum, and that's what Israel has become. And increasingly we're seeing it being used by people in parts of Europe that can no longer live normal lives as Jews, particularly as Orthodox Jews wearing a kippah, or as Zionist Jews proclaiming support for Israel.
Is there anyone in particular in 1932, whether it be in Germany or here in the United States, that you would have wanted to have a conversation with, a sit down with, and talk to them?
There are so many people. There were some lawyers, some very brave lawyers in Germany who stood up against Hitler in the 20s, but of course they were either killed or put on Dachau or managed to escape, or some leaders who committed suicide. I guess one of the people I would have loved to have talked to and shouted at is Gertrude Stein, one of the greatest villains of the Holocaust. People think highly of Gertrude Stein because they say she had good taste in art, but she was an abominable Nazi sympathizer, a Jewish woman with her partner, Alice Toklas, both of whom loved the Nazis. She, Gertrude Stein, wrote that Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, should be given to Hitler. She collaborated with the Gestapo, very likely turned in Jewish children hiding in parts of France. It would have been interesting to come face to face with the face of evil, the face of Gertrude Stein and Alice Toklas, among the most evil people in modern history, who are praised to this day. Feminist scholars adore her, write about her, study her. There was an exhibit in the Met a couple of years ago.
I saw it, of her work and the collection of her brothers as well. Yeah.
And I demanded of the Met, spoke to the curator, that they tell the story of her complicity with Nazism. And finally, they added something, and they sold this book written by a woman at Dartmouth University, a historian. I think the name of the book is A Strange Collaboration. And they finally sold that book at the bookstore after the show so people could at least get a different view of Gertrude Stein. Gertrude Stein ought to be revisited in history, and her true self ought to be exposed. So I would have liked to have a conversation with her and find out what went through her perverted mind.
Your birthday is on September 1st, 1938. You were born in 1938, 1 year to the day that World War II started.
That's right.
Is that something that you think about on your birthday?
I do. And my mother thought about it when I was born because she saw, even in 38, what was clearly able to be anticipated. Remember, we were ready. There were threats against Czechoslovakia. There were all kinds of signs that a horrible cataclysmic war would take place. And so I remember she told me that when I was born, she wondered where her next child would be born and whether war would come to our shores. We were fortunate that they didn't come to our shores. But the other place, you asked me where I'd want to go to, and it clearly would be into the belly of the beast. But if I had to be located only in the United States, I wish I had been born 25 or 30 years earlier. So I could have tried to reverse what was the American policy of inaction in regard to the Holocaust.
Would you have wanted to have been a lawyer in 1932? That's
Sure.
still what you wanted to have done.
Yeah, I think being a lawyer gives you opportunities to be involved not only in the courts and in the legislatures, but also politically and in the media and in whatever other way is possible. Would I have joined the underground ultimately and engaged in violent actions? Certainly I would have justified violent actions against the Nazi regime. Don't know whether I would have been brave enough to do that, but I certainly would have liked to have had the opportunity to do that.
And certainly, had you been in Germany and a lawyer then, you wouldn't have been able to practice.
That's right.
After, what, the Nuremberg laws?
That's right. Even before the Nuremberg laws.
Yeah, I believe in
it became,
1933 when the Nazis
very
came.
difficult for lawyers to practice. And in my book, Abraham, the world's first but certainly not last Jewish lawyer, I write about a lawyer who did manage to practice for a couple of years during the beginning of the Hitler regime. He had opposed Hitler vigorously when he was a lawyer, ultimately escaped to the United States and wrote about his experiences, but really was frustrated that he couldn't do anything.
We've had Rwanda. I've been to Rwanda. I've been to
Right.
Cambodia. I've seen the killing fields.
Me too.
And we've
Yeah.
had Srebrenica. We've had Holocaust since. When are they going to end? Are we still, just because human beings are human beings, still going to repeat and repeat
Well,
all
never
this
again has
genocide?
become again and again and
Yeah.
again. And I think part of the reason is the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan did a lot of good. It really helped promote Western values, and it turned Germany into a vibrant democracy, but at a very heavy cost. The vast majority of hands-on Nazis lived good lives, died in the arms of their children and grandchildren who never knew or never cared about what they had done. I'm somewhere between the Marshall Plan and the Morgenthau Plan. The Morgenthau Plan was to turn Germany into a desolate agrarian country for at least 50 years, close the museums, close the symphony halls, and really collectively punish the people of Germany, who would have overwhelmingly voted for Hitler in a free election. In 1938, he would have won 90-10. And the Marshall Plan, which rewarded, made Hitler's prophecy come true. Hitler said, if we kill the Jews, we'll be wealthier. And they killed the Jews and they were wealthier. Because the price paid for the Holocaust was so low and the rewards so great, it incentivized dictators and tyrants such as Pol Pot and others to engage in the genocide that we saw in Cambodia and in Rwanda and in Darfur, and which we're seeing in different form, obviously, today in Syria. We have not made it clear to dictators and the people who follow them. Remember, it takes millions of people to conduct a genocide, that there will be consequences. So I think our reaction to the Second World War is what incentivized the genocides and the mass killings that have occurred ever since, and turned the promise of never again into the horror of again and again.
Is there anyone that you would want to take with you to help you on your quest?
Oh, sure. I'd love to have a team. I'd love to have taken Elie Wiesel with me to have been the great voice of reason. I'd love to have taken Erwin Kotler with me, who is one of the greatest living human rights lawyers today, the former Minister of Justice of Canada. There are many others who I think would have, if we had a team, would have done a more effective job than one person acting alone.
Can you imagine, though, if on this special one-way ticket you can go back and share what you know now with people then?
That would be the key. Yeah.
If you were to tell them there's a vibrant Jewish state in the state of Israel, that Jewish communities, for the most part, are thriving throughout the world. Of course, there's the rise of anti-Semitism, which we'll get to in a second. But can you imagine what their response would be?
We saw it on the face of Adolf Eichmann when he was fairly tried by an Israeli court with Israeli judges. I actually opposed his execution. I thought it would have been much better to keep him alive and maybe cooperate and tell the Israeli authorities where other Nazis like Mengele were hiding. But everything other than the execution, which I personally opposed, was done very effectively and really sent a very powerful message to Nazis that they had failed in the sense of destroying the Jewish community in the future. They succeeded, unfortunately, in destroying the Jewish civilization of Eastern Europe.
I do want to ask you about the rise of anti-Semitism, not only here in the United States, but around the world. When we have UNESCO not recognizing a Jewish presence on the Temple Mount, we have the BDS, the Boycott, Divest, Sanction movement on campuses that deny Israeli voices, when we have Black Lives Matter calling Israel a genocidal and apartheid state. Is that not the new anti-Semitism? In other words, anti-Israel sentiment, anti-Israel rhetoric is really the new anti-Semitism. Where do you fall on that?
I think it's very important to distinguish legitimate criticism of Israel, which is a good thing. Every country should be criticized. I criticize my own country all the time, and I'm critical of some Israeli policies. I've long been opposed to Israel's settlement policies on the West Bank, and I'm a strong supporter of the two-state solution. Legitimate criticism of Israel is perfectly acceptable, and indeed, if criticism of Israel were deemed to be anti-Semitic, the greatest concentration of anti-Semites in the world would be in Tel Aviv, and the most anti-Semitic newspaper would be Haaretz. There's an enormous difference between legitimate criticism on the one hand and demonization, delegitimation, and applying a double standard. And we know it when we see it. We know organizations that use anti-Zionism simply as a cover for their anti-Semitism. The United Nations is clearly one of them. The UNESCO resolution, you can't explain that in any way other than by anti-Semitism. I think the BDS movement, though it has some people in it who are not anti-Semitic, in its core is anti-Semitic. It is not a movement. It's not a worldwide movement to boycott, divest, and sanction all countries that engage in human rights violations. It's a movement directed only against one country, the nation state of the Jewish people. And it does so unfairly. It is also anti-peace. It's going to make a two-state solution very difficult. The BDS movement does not support the two-state solution. It opposes it. It calls for Palestine will be free from the river to the sea, which means no Israel. Anti-Zionism often morphs into anti-Semitism. We're seeing that with the British Labour Party, which is both anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist. We're seeing it with the Greek Golden Dawn Party, which is both anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist. But it's complicated because in some places we see anti-Semitism combined with support for Israel. We're seeing that in parts of Poland, in parts of Hungary, in other areas, maybe even among some on the extreme right in the United States, not the alt-right. The alt-right is both anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. The neo-Nazi, Ku Klux Klan, David Duke. They hate Israel, they hate America, they hate Jews. But it's much more nuanced for some on the hard right, but not the alt, who are very supportive of Israel, but not particularly supportive of Jewish values. And we see the opposite in some among the hard left, who are supportive of Jews, but very anti-Israel. So the issue has to be approached in a nuanced way. But I have to tell you, you scratch an anti-Zionist deep enough, most of the time you'll find somebody who's anti-Semitic, anti-American, anti-Western, and anti-democratic.
You've had many accolades.
Also the opposite.
Sent your way. Yes, I know also the opposite. I know in the back cover, I didn't bring your book, Taking the Stand, but I know you have a number of choice words that were said about you in the back of Taking the Stand, but you've also been called America's most public Jewish defender and also Israel's single most visible defender, the Jewish state's lead attorney in the court of public opinion. And I just have to say, you really do put your money where your mouth is, because I heard you once speak and you've said that you actually do send, or you did send your law students to Israel.
I do, yeah.
And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about that. And I'm wondering, what's the response when they come back?
It's amazing. Must be 10 or 15 years ago now, it gets to be my age, time flies so quickly and gets compressed. But we decided to send future leaders from Harvard Law School to Israel, mostly not Jewish kids. Because when I look out of my class, I don't just see 150 law students. I see the future President of the United States, the future Chief Justice, the future editor of the New York Times, the future head of Goldman Sachs. They've all passed through my class. So we try to spot and anticipate who the future leaders will be of all ethnic groups, and we send them to Israel, and they come back totally engaged and totally with different views. When you go to a place like Ramallah and you see what the West Bank could look like if there were a two-state solution. You see no Israeli troops, no occupation, no Israeli police, a completely free Palestinian state, city-state within a small geographic area, wealthy, with great restaurants, good shops, a lot of fancy cars, a lot of electronics. You say to yourself, this is not what we've been told about in America. This is not apartheid. This is not genocide. This is a dispute about territory, which should be resolved reasonably with face-to-face negotiation. So I think going to Israel is very important. Sometimes I've accompanied them on the trip. Other times I've had my friends in Israel host them and have them meet the most important people there. And they always come back enthusiastic and positive about Israel.
I'm going to put a link to your book, The Case for Israel, on the show notes page of our website. I do want people to check it out. Of course, it's the go-to book to really understand the situation in Israel and the Middle East.
And it's almost 15 years old now, so I'm actually in the process of thinking about revising it, bringing it up to date, adding new chapters on the Iran deal, on the BDS movement, on things that have happened since. But I think the core arguments in the book are still very valid.
Yeah,
today.
The core arguments in terms of the history really still holds water, obviously. So just to round out the one-way ticket portion of our conversation, it really does sound like 1932 still reigns supreme in your mind. In other words, it's still a part of you. It really guides you, and it's really what keeps you going in many ways.
In many ways. Look, the dream, the ideal would have been to be put back in Germany in 1932 and to live long enough to be on the exodus in 1947, 48, come to Israel and be there for the establishment of the state, which was the greatest response to the Shoah. So my one-way ticket, I think, would start in Germany and probably end in Jerusalem, but I'd miss America because I love America. It's my country. And when Benjamin Netanyahu offered me the job of being Israel's delegate to the United Nations, I was very tempted. I'd love to have gone to the United Nations and speak truth to power, but I am an American, and I want to live my life as an American. So I appreciate your one-way ticket, and I would have accepted it had it been realistic, but I'm very happy to live in America.
So I was recently reading something about Brooklyn, which prompted me to think and to remember that whether it was Mae West or Al Capone or Jay-Z or Neil Simon or Barbra Streisand or Woody Allen or Alan Dershowitz, there are a lot of well-known people that have come out of Brooklyn, and I'm wondering what have they been putting in the water there?
No, one of the greatest honors I had was to have my name among them in the Brooklyn Walk of Fame. So if you now take a walk through the Botanic Gardens in Prospect Park in Brooklyn, you can step on my brick along with the people you mentioned and Larry David and
Larry
so
King.
Many others.
So many.
Look, I grew up, my next door neighbor was Jackie Mason. Down the block was Elliot Gould. One block away was Sandy Koufax. Around the corner was Buddy Hackett. It was a very funny neighborhood. I was a terrible student all the way through high school. I then became a very good student in college and law school. Terrible student all the way through elementary school and high school. But I was very popular among my peers because I was funny. In fact, people thought I should be a stand-up comedian. I would have been a third-rate stand-up comedian, but I used my comedy a lot in teaching my classes, actually sometimes even in arguing cases. I think humor is very important. The other night on TV, I was talking about Comey and what he did in anticipation of the end of the election. And I was being humorous about it. And somebody on the panel on CNN screamed at me, "You can't be humorous about it." I'll be humorous about everything. Some of my favorite movies are humorous films even about the Holocaust. A film called Genghis Cohen about a comedian in Germany in the 1930s. Fantastic film. The story about the Italian Wonderful Life or whatever it was called, Beautiful Life.
Beautiful Life.
I love those movies. You have to be able to have a sense of humor about everything. Some of my favorite deathbed quotes are people who, in their last words, said something memorably humorous. So I'm aspiring to have an opportunity to do that, hopefully some years from now.
You said that people thought you should be a comedian. I also read that you had teachers think that you should either work in a funeral parlor or work in advertising. And I can say I worked in advertising for many years, and I think you would have better clients working in a funeral parlor.
At least they don't stand up and complain.
Exactly. And they pay their bills, I guess, for the most part.
It was actually the New York State Educational whatever placement department. I took a test, and the counselor said that. My Orthodox rabbi said something different. He said, "Look, Dershowitz, you got a good mouth, but not a good mind. You should do something where you have to talk a lot, but not think a lot." And he said, "I could think of two things. One, you could be a lawyer, or two, you could be a conservative rabbi." And I wasn't smart enough to be a rabbi, so I became a lawyer.
Speaking of being a student, you've had many well-known students. You just touched on that just a moment ago. Too long a laundry list, but David Gergen, William Bennett, Elena Kagan, Ted Cruz. You currently have two students that ultimately got married. They're living in public housing in Washington, D.C. They're going to be evicted on January 20th, 2017.
Trump does that all the time.
He evicts people, and he's going to evict your two students. When they were, and if for anyone that doesn't know who we're talking about, of course, it's the president and first lady. When they were in your class, did you know that they were going to be the Barack and Michelle Obama that the world would come to know?
The interesting thing is Barack Obama applied twice to be in my class on legal ethics, but was turned away both times.
Why is that?
Not by me, by the computer. It was a very popular class. It used to get 500 applicants, and only 50 people could be admitted. I knew Barack Obama, and I knew Michelle when they were students. They were, you could tell, Barack Obama was extremely popular. He always wore this stylish leather jacket, and everybody knew he was going to be a future leader. I knew the two of them separately. I didn't know that they had gotten married until I went to a fundraiser for Barack Obama when he was running for the Senate. And Michelle ran over and gave me a hug and said, "Professor Dershowitz, so nice to see you." I said, "Oh, nice to see you. What are you doing here? Are you working for the candidate?" She said, "Working for him. I'm the mother of his children." I didn't know they were married because she was 2 years ahead of him in law school.
They only met when they were in Chicago. She was
his boss working, yeah.
Was it at Sidley and Austin?
I think so, yeah.
I think so. And you're in regular touch with them?
Not in regular touch, no. I used to be in closer connection with the president until I came out strongly against the Iran deal. I was invited to the Oval Office to sit with him and talk about the Iran deal. I was invited to Shimon Peres's state dinner when he received the Medal of Freedom, and I used to meet with him on Martha's Vineyard. Since I came out strongly against the Iran deal, although it wasn't personal, the relationship has been a little bit more distant and tense.
All right. As I mentioned at the top of the show, you've written more than 30 books, published more than 1,000 articles. You continue to contribute to legal thought. You are constantly in demand. You're always on TV and lecturing. We all have 24 hours in a day. How do you squeeze it all in?
First, I like to sleep 8 hours a night. I'm not one of these people who brags about sleeping 2 or 3 hours.
So Arianna Huffington loves you. You know her latest book about the sleep revolution?
No, I don't.
Where she talks about the need to sleep and the importance of sleep.
I like to sleep, and I like to be well rested. I'm very efficient. I can work on 4 or 5 projects at the same time. I'm working on a couple of books now, working on a number of cases. I'm always lecturing. I like to keep busy, but I also love to go to the theater. I love to go to the opera. I tend to go to the opera about once a week, and to theater once or so a week, and to concerts. And so I like living a very full life. I don't like just hanging around, though I also like to take long walks. I try to walk between 5 and 10 miles a day. I don't always succeed, but
outside?
I just walk outside. I don't like machines. The machine I have tells me how far I've walked. New York is a great walking city. I live in Florida during much of the year when it's cold, and I live right near the boardwalk, so I walk there a lot. And everywhere I am, I try to walk. My wife loves to walk as well, so we take long walks together.
I believe someone described you as suffering from Fam's disease.
I do.
Fear of missing something.
Yeah, I can't stand missing anything. Whenever I get invited to things, I like to say yes if I can. Obviously, I can't fit everything in, but I don't like to miss anything. When I was thinking about a career choice, I couldn't decide whether I wanted to be a professor, a litigator, a writer, or a kind of public intellectual.
Not a mortician.
No, not a mortician. I put that one aside. And so I decided to be all four at the same time. Maybe it impacted on any of the careers, but it's what I wanted to do, and it's what made me happy and still makes me happy.
One of the things that you didn't mention that you do is you are a regular flea market goer and an antiquer and a collector. Kindred spirits here, because I am as well. Yeah. You gave up some of your collection. You sold some of your collection just recently, this year, because you are downsizing, as many people do. Not necessarily what object did you give away that was special for you, but out of all the years of collecting, do you have one object that's a standout for you?
The one I gave away that I really regret, you sometimes have regret not buying something, and you also have regret giving away something. I had a Megillat Esther, the Book of Esther, a very old one, which had signatures of prominent rabbis, and don't know why, but I did sell that. We just don't have room. I live in a small apartment in New York, a small apartment in Florida. One of my favorite items is a letter from Thomas Jefferson written on the 25th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, espousing why freedom of speech is so important. I bought that on a Friday, and by Monday I had written 10,000 words of what ultimately became a 50,000-word book on the Jefferson letter, in which not only do I write about it and how I got it and how important it is, but I also engage in a dialogue with Jefferson about some of his ideas, some of which I agree with, some of which I disagree with. I have a campaign medallion from Abraham Lincoln, which I found in a flea market. I have autographs of every single American president. I do not have an autograph of Donald Trump that I can think of. I have to start working on that. I was anticipating having all the presidents. I have an autograph of Hillary Clinton on a kippah. I went to shul with Hillary and Bill Clinton on Martha's Vineyard. I brought them to our congregation.
1993, if I'm not mistaken.
1993 or something, back in his first or second year of the presidency. And I had them both sign the yarmulke, the kippah, after the services were over, and I have that. So I have autographs by many of Israel's prime ministers. I have an autograph of Herzl, a letter from Herzl. I have a wonderful collection, but smaller than it used to be.
Right, because of size reasons. You mentioned Hillary and you mentioned Trump. When I told people that I was going to be speaking with you, everyone says, ask him about the election, ask him about the election. And I'm going to avoid asking you about the election per se, but I know that you have an interest in psychiatry. Yeah. And I'm not suggesting that you would have Trump or Hillary lie down on Dr. Dershowitz's couch and spill their guts to you. They're both very thick-skinned individuals, and I'm wondering just generally whether it's the two of them or anyone that wants to run for president, what is it about their psyche, the psyche of someone to want to run for president?
I think everyone's different. Everyone's different. I think George W. Bush was a reluctant candidate. I think he felt the family tradition required him to run for it. I don't think he was happy being a president. He's a nice guy, really nice person. I was with him in Israel to celebrate Israel's 60th anniversary. I really liked him. I went to the White House on several occasions. Bill Clinton loved being president, being loved. He wouldn't go to sleep at night. He just couldn't. I remember once talking to him about that, saying, you're going to sleep 3 a.m. He said, I have plenty of time to sleep after my presidency. But he didn't want to sleep during his presidency. He just loved everything.
You didn't tell him to get 8 hours like you do.
No, he needed 2 or 3, I think. Everybody's different. I don't know what motivates Trump. I just don't know. I've met him on a couple of occasions, but it was a different Donald Trump than the one who campaigned. And I'm hoping the Donald Trump I met will be the President Trump. There's a big difference between a candidate and a president, and I have hopes that he will be a different president than he was a candidate. Hillary Clinton I've known for years. She is a serious policy wonk, somebody who cares deeply about the issues, and would have been, I think, a very good president. The election ended in a tie, essentially. I predicted it in my book, Electile Dysfunction. I predicted the polls were all wrong. I wrote this when she was ahead by 12 points, and that it would be an extremely close election. I actually predicted that one would win the Electoral College and another would win the popular vote. That's how close I thought it would be. And it ended up with a tie. She won the popular, he won the electoral. Basically, there's no, it doesn't, if it had been the opposite, if she had won a narrow majority, it would still tell us the same thing about the American people. 60 million people were prepared to vote for each of them.
Yeah. And when you travel outside of the bubble here of New York or Washington, D.C. or L.A., you see a very different country.
Oh, yeah. Well, you travel in some parts of New York, you see a very different country.
Yeah.
I am more opposed today to the hard left, which exists in New York City and Brooklyn, than I am to the conservative right, the centrist right. I'm a liberal. I'm a left liberal centrist person. But I think some of the greatest dangers to this country are from the hard left. You had mentioned earlier Black Lives Matter. I wanted to be part of Black Lives Matter. I've devoted my life to civil rights and civil liberties. I went down south in the 60s. I trained to be a civil rights worker. I've litigated civil rights cases. But I cannot have anything to do with an organization that has in its platform a description of only one country in the world, the nation state of the Jewish people, calling it genocidal and apartheid. So I am an enemy of the movement Black Lives Matter, though I am a supporter of the concept of Black Lives Matter. And I will remain an enemy of the movement Black Lives Matter as long as it keeps that anti-Semitic trope in its platform. Hamas also does good things for its people, but it wants to destroy Israel. So don't ask me to support Hamas, and don't ask me to support any organization that has in its platform a description of Israel as genocidal. Genocide was a word invented to describe the killing of 6 million Jews, the slaughter of 6 million Jews. How dare anybody use that term to describe Israel, which is simply trying to defend itself against neighbors who seek its destruction?
Oh, I definitely agree. As I said, you've advised, you've met so many world leaders. And when we talk about Hillary Clinton, she could have been the first female president of the United States. Other countries have had female leaders, whether it be the United Kingdom or Israel, Golda Meir, for example.
But Golda Meir was the first
Yes.
ever to be elected head of a country who didn't have a husband, a father, a sibling, or another close relative precede her. She was the only person who did it all together on her own.
Because I was going to ask you about her, because I know you interviewed her
I did.
for the show The Advocates. And can you talk a little bit about your take on her, your memories of her, and so on? Because she was a remarkable individual. She was a real force of nature.
When I was going to see her, the man who I had clerked for, Justice Arthur Goldberg, who was one of my mentors, said, you have to do me a favor. You have to smuggle a carton of Lucky Strike cigarettes into her. This is before we knew that cigarettes cause cancer, at least before I did. Otherwise, I wouldn't have done it.
And we're talking about which year?
1970. So I managed to put a carton of Lucky Strike cigarettes inside of my jacket, and I smuggled it in when I got to see her and gave it to her. And she said, "Oh, it's Arthur Goldberg." She knew that he was going to give her. They were friends. They were childhood friends in Chicago and in
Milwaukee,
Wisconsin, both. They both belonged to young Zionist groups. They were probably approximately the same age. So she got to like me a lot. She invited me to her home for chicken soup. And I spent time with her, and I saw her on several occasions thereafter. She was a force of nature. She was like every other leader. She had flaws, but she was a very powerful person. She was taken by surprise in the Yom Kippur War and has been much criticized by Israelis for not being sufficiently prepared for the Egyptian-Syrian attack on Yom Kippur of 1973. But she was a very powerful and bold leader.
Can you imagine what she or Ben-Gurion would make of Israel today as such a high-tech, progressive country? Because that was really their wish, wasn't
it? It was Jefferson versus Hamilton. Jefferson wanted to see the United States an agrarian country built on the South, and Hamilton wanted to see it, you couldn't use the word high-tech, but a modern industrialist global power. And that's the difference between, on the one hand, Ben-Gurion, and on the other hand, Netanyahu. Netanyahu is Alexander Hamilton in Israel's history, and Ben-Gurion is Jefferson. And the virtues and vices of both of them apply equally to the virtues and vices of Israeli leaders. They would be surprised, but I think Israel has to become part of the global economy, and it's done a good job being part of the global economy.
By the way, did you see Hamilton?
I did.
Did you love it? I didn't see it yet. I could have seen it at the Public, and I just didn't see it. I thought, what am I going to go see this musical for? But
I loved it.
The joke's on me. I know it's supposed to be brilliant. I'll see it when I'm 1,000 years and tickets will be available and cheap enough. Listen, we're going to leave it at that. Alan Dershowitz, this has been a great pleasure. I want to thank you for joining us here on the One Way Ticket Show, sharing your one-way ticket destination and more. We'll have info about you on the show notes page of our website, theonewayticketshow.com. Also would love to hear from you. Shoot me an email, Stephen@theonewayticketshow.com. Share your one-way ticket destination, and I'll read it on air. I didn't this time around because we had just way too much to talk about. But meantime, it's a wrap for this edition of the One Way Ticket Show. For Professor Alan Dershowitz and the entire crew, I'm Stephen Shalowitz, and we'll see you next time.